Hello, welcome to HLA Live. HLA Live is our regular broadcast on the HLA YouTube channel as well as all the other social media channels. Each week we talk to interesting people from across the HLA community.
Good evening, everyone. I am really excited to be chairing tonight's meeting.
Hi, I'm Rosie Spooner and I'm hosting HLA Live this Wednesday.
And I'm an HLA scholar and I'm also going to be your host this evening.
To share with us their ideas and their innovations and hopefully bring them to a global audience.
Quite quick, we have ideas, let's do this, let's do that. So
many of the topics come from our community, with scholars and faculty expressing an interest in many of the discussions that we're about to have.
Hello everyone and welcome to the HLA Live session on widening participation in the postgraduate realm.
Homelessness and health.
Addiction and the new normal.
HLA programs are built on 6 pillars. The leader is an innovator and entrepreneur. The leader is a communicator. The leader is a manager. The leader as a negotiator. The leader is a follower, and the leader is a philosopher. If you are interested in becoming a HLA scholar, why not get in contact? Many of the episodes in HLA Live will cover one or more of these important pillars. The HLA team consists of Pedra, Eamon, Tim, Riddy, Alistair, Adil and Trisha, and a range of other HLA scholars and faculty.
I'm really excited to introduce our next Q&A with Lois Pace, and I'm just going to give the stage and the word right to her to introduce herself.
Hi, Vasily. Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here with you today. As Vasily said, I'm Lois, and I run an organization called the Global Health Council here in the US.
Amazing, and it is a true honor to have you here, and thank you very much for giving up your time to talk to us. So just because I hope everyone will know you already, but if they don't, can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's see, where do I begin? I already mentioned being president and executive director of this great organization. I should probably tell you a little bit about the organization, which is, it's a coalition of other organizations, frankly, who are all focused on global health issues. A lot of our members, if you will, work in different countries around the world, really trying to do their best to advance health in those communities. And we also do a lot of work here in the US, ensuring that governments like the United States understand the value of that work, continue to invest in that work. But we're also trying to be responsible in this space and not perpetuate maybe what have been some longstanding, less than helpful practices in global health and development. So I think it's also our responsibility at Global Health Council and my responsibility as its leader to really think critically about our work as well, and not just try and push through what we've been doing all this time, but rather think about ways we can improve on that.
Absolutely fantastic. And what was your journey? How have you come to find yourself in this position?
Yeah, that was an interesting journey, honestly, because I am not, or at least I don't consider myself a Washington person so much. Other people surely do. But honestly, I got my start in Los Angeles, California, where I'm from, where I was born and raised. And I left home for a time, but then came back and worked at the community level there. And that's important for me to start any story about myself with, because that particular setting was low income and had a number of, I guess, societal challenges in terms of gun violence and food deserts and just sort of limited access to healthcare services. That was my experience, honestly, in many ways, growing up in that particular part of Los Angeles, California, here in the States, and working in that part of the city years down the road. And so that's something I'm proud of, not because of what I did, but frankly because of what partners and community leaders taught me as part of that process and as part of that experience, you know, the value and importance of truly engaging with and understanding what their needs are and trying to meet those. And I didn't always get it right. Certainly, it was definitely a learning experience. And I just hope that I offered them as much as they offered me. But I continue to try and work in that way throughout my career, eventually setting my sights and intentions and doing similar work in other countries. And there are a couple of reasons for that, I suppose. But honestly, I didn't necessarily see it as so different from what I was leaving. Just again, with my experience and perspective here in the States, I consider the work in low resource settings or in settings where, there are communities that are kind of left out or left by the wayside. I was very interested in how those communities worked in other parts of the world. And really, I'm just constantly thinking about ways we can make those connections or even build those bridges so that we can learn from each other, or frankly, people who are living again in those communities, working in that way together day to day, can kind of have that connection in a way that will kind of lift up their work and their efforts and their progress equally. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just really shocking.
It really does. No, that's perfect. And it is very fascinating because clearly your background, where you grew up, where you're coming from, really influenced your decision and later on also your career. And I think from our perspective, especially being now living in these well-connected planet, Earth, where we live in, we often come in contact with all the different cultures and the way healthcare is delivered in different countries. And I think we've finally come to understand that some of those misconceptions that we previously had are coming down with those, and those barriers are not there anymore. What do you think is the current healthcare situation around the globe? How is it different? How is it similar between countries?
Yeah, it's really hard, I think, to try and summarize that. But I think what we see are a couple of things. I mean, we see countries that really are keen to and trying to advance this idea of universal health or health coverage for their populations, for their citizens. I think that that's important, especially when we consider the gaps in access that I mentioned. That's not a uniquely American problem, right? It's an issue that we find in different parts of the world. And so I can appreciate and even support the momentum around universal health worldwide. And I'm glad that has, I guess, picked up steam again in the past couple of years. It's not a new idea, and it's certainly not something that, it's certainly something that some countries have been doing for an extended period of time. And I think the idea is to ensure that there is an even greater, wider embrace of those principles. But I think we also need to be careful assuming that just because a country, at least at the political or policy level, has made that commitment or has even rolled out that type of program, it doesn't mean that there aren't disparities, right, within those countries. And so I think there's still special groups or populations that can be left out, even with some universality in place, or at least, as I said, kind of like as a stated or expressed commitment. And so I think that's also something that's kind of a common thread around the world, and something we have to figure out, right? Like how to reach these groups that are somehow hidden or frankly sort of ignored. I mean, they've been there, they will always be there, but it's really up to us, those of us with power, with privilege, with access to all the things those benefits afford, to look for them, right? And I think it's one of the reasons I'm really keen to find a way not to only identify opportunities to build bridges across like clearly defined groups like countries, but also through maybe these less clearly defined means by connecting these special groups or populations.
Amazing. And you touched on something extremely important. We often create those differences. We see the differences between the countries, but we often fail to see those within our own country, our own local community sometimes, seeing those huge disparities, whether they're financial, socioeconomic, or perhaps simply which neighborhood you grew up in. And that is such a huge contrast, absolutely. And how do you think we can thrive at reducing the gap between people within the same community, within the same country, in order to provide them free point of access in healthcare?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's listening to them, right? I think first and foremost, it's meeting them where they are, right? Not expecting them to come to us wherever we are in our sort of castle on a hill, but rather ensuring that we are seeking them out, we're finding them, and then when we do, if and when we do, giving them the microphone or megaphone, giving them the platform to share what it is their needs really are. I mean, some of this in a very, I guess, kind of academic sense could just come down to data collection, right? And understanding the story by those means. But then I think there's an anecdotal approach to this too, which might seem, I don't know, like a bit more loose and fuzzy, but the storytelling is just as important as the statistical data for me. Because there's a richness behind those stories that I think can sometimes get missed by the numbers. But in any case, gathering that information, understanding the experience is first and foremost important. And then I want to be sure that whatever we do is not solely extractive, right? We're not only going and asking, okay, well, what do you need? Because what's our accountability to truly following up? I mean, we have to act on that information. And so that's another part of it, is ensuring that we are putting in place, even if it's sort of a phased approach to delivering on a promise. I think government and I think other people, even sort of without the highest levels of power, have a role to play in offering some stepwise solutions to the problem. Until we can, for example, provide healthcare for everyone, what can we still put in place to ensure that these gaps close or a little bit more narrow until they close entirely? So that's I think how I'm envisioning it is really coming to them, understanding them, and then following through for them. And I have to be clear too, not all of the decision making should be done sort of in a top-down way. So ideally there is a consistent, continuous role that these minority groups, for lack of a much better term, right, play in their own determination, right? They should be at the table deliberating and making these decisions so that those actions can truly be effective and sustainable. That's my dream.
Absolutely. I say I share the same dream, and I hope I would have the same commitment in bringing it to become reality as well. And I think you touched on something quite important, and we already mentioned about there will be policies. There is the intention from anybody, the government, anybody power actually creating this kind of healthcare provision, and then we want to gather the data. But actually, is how do you continue the momentum of something that is happening? Even if you bring someone to the table, how do you make sure that those at power, those who still feel like they're above, are still committed to that up until the gap is so narrow that can't be seen, it doesn't exist anymore?
Yeah, we have to create some sort of incentive, right, Vasily, for people to know that once is not enough. We don't want to have a tokenistic approach to this stuff. And I don't know, I think I'd love to hear what you have to say about that, or what your community has to offer in that regard. There's some people who really talk about making an economic argument or other kind of business case for this type of engagement. I struggle a little bit with that. I see the value of doing that, but I want to be careful reducing the idea of access to kind of a profit-driven agenda. And so I would love to find some balance to that, some counterpoint to that, and really think about our humanity or solidarity or other sort of common purpose or responsibility to people, aside from what it does for me. I don't want that to be the only motivator for decision makers. But regardless of the message we choose, I think the narrative is important. I think also advocacy is key in this case, right? And this is why groups like Global Health Council exist, arguably, because we can bring and or represent the voices of those who might not have the same influence standing alone. And so if we can organize and mobilize these stakeholders on a regular basis and in a meaningful way, I think that applies the pressure we need to sustain momentum around the action that government leaders and other people in power can take.
I agree. I was thinking as you were talking, I was thinking about my background growing up in Italy and now training here in the UK. And although I lived in both developed countries, I can see the clear difference in the way healthcare is provided and how we both complain about our healthcare back in Italy and then now here in the UK with the NHS. And I can see how you speak about being profit driven, especially when those at power, those managing the provision of healthcare, only cares about the numbers, what you're able to bring in and what you're taking out of the national pocket. And this is very hard when we're trying to introduce the humanitarian factor from that point of view. And from my perspective, it truly breaks my heart when at the beginning of the pandemic here in the UK, we saw that those who were dying, those who were suffering the most were still those minorities we were convinced did not have any discrimination against. And we were convinced from a position of power, of a position of the majority looking down at the minority groups. And it is still shocking, and it really broke the ground we were standing on here in the UK, recognizing those people who have reached high positions within our institutions, within our healthcare, are yet suffering because of all the injustice that's been perpetrated against throughout the years. And like you said, it's a combination between our healthcare provision, our discussion with the stakeholders, but perhaps the way we structure our society as well. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think those social or even structural barriers cannot be denied. We have the same story here, and I have to say I'm very sorry to hear that it's a shared experience across our countries. Even looking at the rates here, and I was looking at them again last night, and recognizing the fact that African Americans, for example, don't make up a large portion of this country. I mean, we have a significant presence. There is a wide range of minorities that make up the majority of America, right? And yet, when you look at the rates of COVID deaths in particular, it's completely out of balance and not in sync with or proportionate to where things should be if you consider our sort of how much we make up in the population. And it's similar for Latinx groups as well here in terms of their risk or mortality, and it's tragic. And it's not, you're right, it's not just a health issue, right? There are reasons for those communities, those families and individuals being left behind, and those are deeply rooted in our country's not so distant history, at least in the case of the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think about these disparities, and perhaps it's steering away from some of the discussion that we had so far, as a member of the LGBTQ community myself, I often think you shouldn't simply be not homophobic, not racist. And it's a discussion that we've seen across social media so much. You should be anti-racism, anti-homophobia, anti-transphobia. And what I'm thriving for, especially in my own community, as much as I can with the people surrounding me, is empowering others to own those feelings, to own their position within society to achieve that. But it's often difficult. I think we always see it with our colleagues and friends and sometimes even family members to have that difficult discussion. And how do you think you can empower others to support this movement to bring about equality, not only within society, but in healthcare, which is perhaps one of the most constant aspects we will all face in our lives throughout the globe?
Yeah. I mean, that's a big question, right? How to bring about equality in healthcare and inspire people to get behind it. Well, I wonder if we talk about it in the way that you started to, right? I mean, is there something to be said for just helping people understand that, you know, there's this common perception that if only people would just take care of themselves, right? And, you know, try harder to change their behaviors and, you know, prioritize health as an issue. It's like, I want to tell them, look, these moms, you know, these single moms, for example, like, it's not that they want to be unhealthy, right? It's not that they want their kids to, you know, be underfed. It's that they don't have time, the resources, they might not know where to go, or it's too far where they need to go, or they, you know, people have a lot going on when they're trying to put food on the table, keep money in their pockets, let alone fight racism and discrimination. And so, yeah, like, some things are going to fall by the wayside. So I feel like I'm going to come back to this idea of connecting the dots across things. You know, to what degree can we help people, and by people I mean the general public, maybe understand that it's not just a health issue, right? Or that health is just much more broad than I think how people traditionally define it. And it really is about some of these other, socioeconomic or structural factors. And then I think, you know, the next sort of question might be, well, then what happens if we do open that up, right? And maybe this gets a little bit into sort of the movements that sprung up this year, and this past summer, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, but, you know, the pointing to the injustices then, right, themselves, and really helping people understand the roots under the tree. You know, if we see the tree as health, then kind of the impact of those injustices really kind of taking all of that away and forcing people to look beneath the surface at, again, what can be driving factors that put people at a disadvantage from day one. And I was heartened to see that, at least in the States, and I think in other countries, finally a different level of recognition of that reality. Yeah. And, you know, almost an acceptance that it's not all in our heads, you know, those of us who have been at some sort of disadvantage. Like, this is real, people's lived experience, right? And you know, empathy goes a long way.
Yeah, I agree.
So I feel that those types of actions are inspiring. They have been inspiring, and are, you know, a step in the right direction to getting more people to understand, again, the fundamental nature of what we're up against.
I've just been elected earlier this year, this academic year, as Deputy Chair of Education for our British Medical Association, as within the students' community. Thank you. And some of the work that we're doing is trying to bring more inclusivity and diversity within the medical curriculum. The usual discussion that we have, well, if you're trying to introduce something, that something else must come out, which is something that doesn't sit well with me, and we're heading towards this. And when I think back in my own personal journey, coming from Sicily in Italy, and we were relatively included within our national climate, but at the same time excluded. And I remember my perspective of minorities was very narrow, and it was very old-minded from that perspective. I didn't have a progressive, I didn't have a modern view, outlook onto it. And coming to the UK certainly broadened my horizons beyond anything I could ever see. And the movement, even just this year, really shook my own understanding of what was happening around the globe, because I'd never been taught and never been experiencing it up until now. And I'm ashamed of saying that society had failed to tell me, to make me recognize what has actually gone wrong for so long and what's still going on wrong. So you spoke about directions, and that's something from our perspective what we're trying to achieve. What do you think what directions are we taking following the Black Lives Matter and movement, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic itself? Where are we heading?
Ooh, well, I mean, I guess that's up to the people, right? I mean, look, staring it right in the face in the way that you did this past summer is the right step in my mind. And I think each of us has to do that, even those of us like me with lived experiences, right? Because I do still have a level or high degree of privilege in multiple ways. And so sort of stepping back and re-examining what our role has been in perpetuating the problem, how complicit we might have been, and then also how we have contributed to progress, right? Like, we don't have to always beat up on ourselves. I think we can think about maybe ways that we've done well and good. But it starts at a very individual level. And then I think, speaking to the collective, I still want to come back to the centering solutions on the experiences and even further the perspectives and voices of those affected. So as we're thinking about what needs to happen, right, it's really going to those communities and really asking, well, what does progress look like to you? And not being careful not to burden them with solving all of our problems. It has to be a sort of a joint effort and taking ownership of like our own role in those changes. But I think as inclusive as we can be as part of that process, the better, so that we don't end up in another situation where maybe what we're doing is not quite right. And that's hard. It's something that I don't think we do very well generally as Americans, in my view. It's certainly not something that I have always done very well, even in the role that I play, where I work. I hope that I do a better job personally, but I think it's a work in progress for many of us. And there are some people who knock it out of the park and who get it right. And so I try to turn to and look to them as examples of how I could improve in the process. But I think any good marker is sort of testing or asking the people most affected, hey, is this okay?
Absolutely. I'm thinking in my own sphere, and I've stopped generalizing as much as I have done in the past, because I don't think don't worry. I still do it all the time. I think it's our way of better understanding the world around us. But yet again, I think some of the environments where I worked, and I know I certainly feel more empowered to bring about change or to be an advocate, which sometimes it's what you need to be for a lot of the people around you who are facing different difficulties in whichever area of their life that really is. I do agree with that. And after we collect that experience, we hear people's voice, sometimes that cry for help, for change to be brought about. And we're taking already, I think, this year a huge leap forward, and I hope that we will continue. And I think ultimately this change is unstoppable. It will happen, but it depends how close that point will be in the future. How do you think, what are the difficulties we might encounter when actually creating this change, when actually putting in place and implementing it?
They're probably vast, right? I think we've seen, I don't know, in my experience here, I've seen, I don't want to call it a backlash, although I think that there's been some semblance of a backlash here, but coming back to the problem being so deeply rooted, I think sometimes it can feel like we take a couple of steps forward and a couple more steps back later on, and that can be frustrating. I think, for better or worse, for the time being, money's and resources still drive a lot of progress. And so, we can have the best of intentions and even like the strongest voice. And yet if like the resources don't come along with those words, even if some action is taken, even if some policy is passed, then it just seems to sort of fade away as a priority. So I think what's really important is to ensure that whatever progress we make is part of a holistic package that has, the sort of supporting infrastructure underneath what we want to see. So it might be obvious, but it's just not always something that comes as part of an advocacy campaign or is considered, after a shorter term win. It's sort of like, well, what's the long-term gain and sort of staying power of this change is what I feel like you're asking. And so in the US context, largely for me at a policy level, I think that often involves the resources. It also involves the champions too, and depending on how we have like converted people to our cause, and broaden that tent so that we're not just reliant on kind of one policymaker to make a change for us, but like a cohort of powerful individuals to support that work, then it has a greater likelihood of surviving. And then the longer it stays in place, if it survives after a year or several years, then it's harder to kind of dismantle those changes. So that's kind of how I think about what we do to ensure longer term success.
Absolutely. Okay, that's very useful, especially from my perspective, being interested in medical politics. Perhaps that's quite important, creating those connections. And you spoke about difficulties, and from a very practical point of view, certainly you wouldn't be in the position you're holding today without that knowledge and expertise that you've developed in the field. How do you think we overcome the difficulties in order to establish a new service and driving quality improvement?
Self-care is really important. I believe strongly in checking in with oneself and just giving ourselves as much grace as possible, even when we stumble, even when we question everything we're doing. I don't practice it as well as I would like, but it is certainly a principle I hold dear, and I am grateful when others remind me of the value of that self-care and that focusing on myself just so that I can be a better version of myself. I think that's probably the best way that I might be able to answer that. I mean, of course, as you said, this is not without its challenges or difficulties. I think sometimes we as a community will work towards something that we just won't get. And that can be hard. And I think many of us in the US have endured that in some ways. Given the current political climate, a lot of our work has been called into question. I mean, who knew that healthcare would become so political? And healthcare workers by association. And so that's been really challenging for a lot of us to endure. And it's been hard to justify stepping back or taking a break because it seems so dire, the situation, because it is so dire. Really understanding my community has been important to me, and knowing to whom I might be able to pass a baton so that they can continue running the race while I take a rest is something that I think about as well. I don't know if that's sort of the answer you were seeking, but that's where my mind went as you were talking.
Yes, and it follows up. I think this is more of a personal question, if you like. What lessons have you learned throughout your journey, throughout your career up until now? And I'm sure there'll be many more lessons to come, but what lessons do you feel have stuck around so strong to you for so long? What would you like to share with us?
I mean, I'd like to say humility. I just knowing what I don't know is key or has been key. It doesn't sound very humble to say humility first off, but I mean it sincerely. I think also the flip side is, especially as a woman and a woman of color, and until recently, perhaps a young woman of color, being more confident in what it is I can contribute, and standing firmly in that space, leading accordingly, and not necessarily listening to my own voice or others questioning why I'm in the room or at the table.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other lesson is probably one I started with, the acknowledgement and appreciation of others, elders, peers, others that have been my guide and have made me who I am and have offered me their gifts even without full credit or acknowledgement by others. I think that is just something I always want to remember, no matter where I am or what I do. But yeah, I think it's really those three in terms of my personal journey and lessons, and how I move through this world. I mean, they're the standard kind of tips about, you fall down, you get back up, that kind of stuff. And I think those are all still true. But yeah, I think that's different for me. That's, that can be very like results oriented, some of that framing. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes I just want to stop and take care of my spirit.
Yes.
And understand kind of where I am, just as a person or human in this world, and how I'm showing up for others.
Beautiful. It's very inspirational. So thank you. It's just having your perspective from your life. Thank you. And
of course, it's been great talking to you.
Absolutely. So closing it, if you like, one last question for you.
Sure.
What do you think, what does it take to be a leader and a good leader in this crazy climate we're currently living in, whether it's the political situation, is the current pandemic, whatever it is? What do you think it takes to be a great leader?
I think acknowledging that it is just overwhelming, and not pretending like it isn't. And, it's life-changing. And for some, much more than others. But I think for everyone, to a certain degree, we're all feeling the weight of the world right now. And you have to say that out loud, especially as a leader, right?
Yes.
That's number one. I think something else that I continue to fall back on is something that I actually heard my mother say. So for context, my mother is also African American, and she was born and raised in the southern part of the US, which I probably don't need to give people a history lesson, but that particular part of the United States, as she was coming up and even, through her adolescence, still had segregationist policies and was, really dealing with a great degree of like structural racism. It's not to say that we don't have some semblance of that today in the States, but at least, we've had the passage of the Civil Rights Act and some other policies that try to correct those injustices. But, she didn't have the benefit of those things for a part of her life, and in fact, lived through that movement, or that version of the movement. And when I asked her recently how she felt about how things were evolving and whether we were moving backwards, she reminded me of this arc that civil rights leaders often talk about, the fact that there is a long journey or a long road, but we're still moving in the right direction. And my mother, for her part, she's said something like, there's still more of us than them.
Yeah.
And I'm we're not going back no matter how much they want us to. We've already passed that point. And so I can appreciate that, right? Because it can feel, at least to me at times, as though, and I've heard others say this to me, wow, like it feels so scary to think that we might go back to the way things were, or that other people want that to happen, that we might lose so much ground on progress we've made either in health or society or in other ways. And that doesn't have to be true. Like even these current losses or feelings of loss and grief, however powerful, and they are powerful, they needn't be permanent, I guess. And they also needn't be definitive, and I think I'm resisting the urge to believe that we're going back to ground zero. No, we're definitely sliding. We definitely are clawing to stay up top or to make more progress climbing this mountain, but we're not at the bottom of that rock.
Yeah.
And so I think as leaders, really being able to see the forest for the trees and understand where we are in the fight and acknowledging that we might not see the end of this. We might not see the top of that mountain, even during our time as leaders, as actors in this space. We're in it, and we're in a good part of it. And we're still winning to some degree because of where we are. And the fact that we're standing our ground is still a success.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for ending on such a beautiful, positive note. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Lois, for being with us, for talking to us, for sharing your wisdom, your true wisdom, and that of your mother and of your upbringing with us. It's been a true pleasure. Thank you very much, Lois, for joining us. And I hope...
Thank you, Vasily. I appreciate you.
Marvelous. I hope we get to talk to you at some point in the future again, and looking forward to hearing all the amazing things from you. Thank you.
Of course. Same.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you to everyone that made tonight's episode possible. Whenever our scholars are thinking about complex problems facing our health systems, we encourage them to think about how they make significant change in the world of healthcare. We are incredibly lucky to have some incredible scholars in the HLA. They use the HLA as a platform to take their ideas and bring them to fruition. If you are interested in the work of the HLA, why not join us at one of our future HLA events? Why not join one of our programs? Why not even become a HLA scholar? Thank you for joining us. My name is Johan Marlwana, the director of the HLA, and it's a good night from all of us.